Thank you. And it's so really heartwarming to see people who came to honor my father and on Zoom and here in person. Thank you for being here. I'm going to stick to my lines because I may get emotional, and so I have it here. And and I want to start just with just a little bit of information about my dad, and then we'll jump into the learning. So my father, Gideon Rosner, lived a full life and managed to live it fully. He was born in 1928 in Tel Aviv to his parents Aryeh and Yona, and was raised in Haifa. Similarly to the Great Depression of the 1930s in the US, living in Israel during those times was very difficult financially, and his family was very poor. As a result, he spent most of his time in boarding schools as a child, and I think this impacted him quite a lot. He was always like a lone wolf, and even his rapport with his parents was a little bit shaken because of it. In high school, he was accepted, though, to the Kaduri Agricultural School in northern Israel, where many of Israel's famous leaders at the time attended. So, for example, Igal Alon graduated Kaduri 10 years before, and Yitzhak Rabin 6 years before my father did. And during those times, it was the British mandate, and so the students didn't want to take their finals, so they won't get a British Teudat Bakrut, and that will play a role later on in the story. Once he graduated high school, my father served in the Palmach, the elite fighting force of the Haggadah, during the British Mandate. And after the War of Independence, which began actually on May 6th, today, 74 years ago, Gideon joined the Israeli merchant fleet as a radio officer. And he sailed to Africa, South and North America, and brought a lot of goods. As you know, Kufat Atzenna, there was no food. And so we needed goods to come to Israel, and he was fortunate to be on those fleets. But also, he brought Jewish immigrants, mostly from North African countries, to the newly established Israel. He was telling me a story about bringing the Jews of Morocco, like being on that ship, one of those two big ones, at least, that brought them years ago. Later on, he taught himself air navigation and joined El Al and helped navigate planes using the stars alone. And when he was 50 years old, a year after I was born, I was a late born. My dad was married twice, and I'm the youngest out of four. And so when I was a year old and he was 50, the gyro-based auto navigation system made his job obsolete, and he needed to get a job. And he decided to go back to university with no Teudat Bagrut and study law. And so he was accepted on condition he's going to be a stellar student, and he did. He was able to do that. And in the final 34 years of his life, my father dedicated himself to defend mostly the elderly and those on the fringes of society by fighting on their behalf in court. My father modeled hardworking ethics and an endless determination and grit. And he instilled in us a strong sense of justice and moral compass, and taught me the love of life. Sorry. He loved us immensely, even though he often had a really hard time to express it, and I miss him very much. So, for today's learning, I can't read if I can see. So I chose to focus on inheritance law, and because of his work as a lawyer, he did a lot of different law, everything but criminal law and ishut, divorce, because he himself experienced divorce. But one of his main things was the inheritance law, Yerusha. And unfortunately, many families find themselves fighting about matters of inheritance. Not only that we are genetically predisposition to competition and conflict, but also our psychological sense of self is often intertwined with the approval that an inheritance represents, especially when the person who dies is a parent. In addition, we're genetically hardwired to be on the outlook for exclusion, sometimes finding it even when it doesn't really exist. And lastly, some of the families fight because of the death of a loved one and the anxieties that this death evokes for those who are left behind. But worse than that are the cases of family disputes about inheritance which take place while the parents are still alive. And my father often found himself defending the elderly against their own children who were trying to take control and disinherit them from their possessions. So in honor of these honorable efforts, Rabbi and I chose to learn with you today from texts from the 8th chapter of Bava Batra. And just as background, in general, the inheritance laws found in this chapter are based on the verses from Bamidbar 27 in response to the claim made by Tzlofchad's daughters. So the law that we see in Bamidbar reads as follows. Further speak to the Israelites people as follows. If a man dies without leaving a son, he shall transfer his property to his daughter. If he has no daughter, you should assign his property to his brothers. If he has no brothers, you shall assign his property to his father's brothers. If his father had no brothers, you shall assign his property to his nearest relative in his own clan, and he shall inherit it. And then it says, והייתה לבני ישראל לחוקת משפט כאשר ציווה אדוני את משה. This shall be a law of perpetuity, if you wish, for the Israelites in accordance with the Lord's commandment to Moses. And so the first Mishnah in the 8th chapter, which we'll be learning, deals with the order of inheritance, and it's divided into 4 categories. All of those who inherit from others, nochalin, and those who, when they die, bequeath property to others, and these are the manchilin. And if you're a little bit confused, and if you find it a little bit hard to follow so far, so you are among good company. The laws we're about to learn are not only require a lot of a strong sense of logic, but also the ability to hold information and follow up the family tree as you go along. And so I hope you find it enjoyable. And just before Rabbi Kligfeld takes over and run us through the Mishnah, I will then come and bring my own perspective. I want to say just a prayer for the lifting of the soul of my father. יהי רצון מלפניך, אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו, שיעלה לרצון לימוד זה שאנחנו לומדים לשם נשמת גדעון בן אריה, עליו השלום, ובזכות לימוד זה, האל הגדול, הגיבור והנורא, השוכן עד וקדוש שמו, שתצרור נשמתו בצרור החיים, ותמחול ותסלח ותכפר ותמחוק את כל מה שחטא ועבר ופשע לפניך, או עשה דבר שלא כרצונך, ואל תזכור לו שום חטא ועוון ופשע ועבירה, אלא כל המצוות שעשה, תזכרנו לטובה. ורוחות תרגיע בחלק היושבים בגן עדן, נשמתו תתעדן בטוב הצפון לצדיקים ותשיב בכבוד מנוחתו, ולקץ הימין יעמוד גורלו. וילווה אליו השלום, ועל משכבו יבוא שלום, יכתיב יבוא שלום ינוחו על משכבותם. הוא וכל בני ישראל השוכבים עמו בכלל הרחמים והסליחות, אמן כן יהי רצון, יהי לי רצון עם רפי והיגיון ליבי לפניך, אדוני צורי וגואלי. Rabbi.
Thank you, Yonatan. Already you've done a great zechut for your father's memory. As Yonatan described, this is a really complicated Mishnah. It's short, but each line you could spend 20 minutes unpacking, and we're not going to do the full unpacking, but I want you to get the basic rhythm of it and the basic information so that when Yonatan gives his commentary, it'll make sense a little bit. I was telling Yonatan before, I have books on my shelf that I have owned for decades, and I guess I hadn't learned this Mishnah in this particular volume in a long time, and I see my notes in here from I don't know when. It could be from 1991 or 1997. And what is clear to me is that I didn't understand it then either. Um, it's to keep this all in your head without a chart is really complicated. In some ways, it's a classically constructed Mishnah because the Mishnah loved 2x2 grids, right? So thinking of a category, there are those who do both X and Y. There are those who do X but not Y. There are those who do Y but not X, and those who do neither X nor Y. That's how this Mishnah is constructed, but you'll see, hopefully, that one of those sections is utterly redundant, and there are many layers of commentary in the Mishnah that wonder why even it was recited, and it may have been because it was easier to memorize that way, because if something is in a memorizable, memorable pattern, without Safaria and without written text, it was easier to transfer to the next generation. But let's see if we can get basic pshat. Yesh nochalin umanchilin. There are many words in Hebrew for inheritance. There's the root that Yonatan used, yarash, to bequeath, and there's also nochel, nun chet lamed. And as if you know a little bit about Hebrew, if a word is in the pa'al binyan, then it's a straight verb, and if it's in the he field, then it's causing someone else to do the same action. So yesh nochalin, there are those who inherit, umanchilim, and also cause others to inherit. The word that we would use in English would be bequeath, right? So those relationships where I can inherit from you and you can inherit from me. There are relationships in a family tree where I might inherit from you, but you would never inherit from me. I would never bequeath to you. Flip it, and you can already anticipate the redundancy because the sections 2 and 3 of this have to be mirrors of one another, yet they're both recited. Yesh manchilim v'lo nachlin. There are those who bequeath but don't inherit. That's just the inverse of what we said before, but it's still said explicitly. And then the last one, lo nochalin v'lo manchilim. There are people on our family tree who might be geometrically as close to others early in the list, but because of the specific way the Jewish inheritance law goes, you neither inherit from them nor do you bequeath to them. And now we have the specifics. So this is also a common Mishnaic tool. You have a klal, a general principle, and now you have the specifics. Elu nochalinu manchalim. Here are those people who, in their relationships, are in both a inheriting and bequeathing relationship. Ha'av et habanim, v'habanim et ha'av, which was also redundant, because if we're saying that these relationships are in both a bequeathing and inheriting relationship, all you have to say is father and son, and the inverse is already implied, but still the Mishnah says it, right? So just think of it, a father and a son in biblical law. If the father dies, certainly the son inherits. If the son dies and left no male descendants, then the father would inherit from him. So they are in a inheriting and bequeathing relationship. So those might be a little obvious. And then the third one that are also in this category, v'ha'achim min ha'av. So to explain this situation, I'll just read you Kahati, who's one of the 20th century explicators of the Mishnah. Meit adam v'lo hiniach zera. A person dies, hiniach zera, and didn't leave a child. V'aviv eno kaham, nor is that person's father alive. Right? So it's a terrible situation. A man dies, no children, no father. Achiv me'aviv yorshimoto. His brothers from his father, that's an important distinction in biblical law. His brothers from his father inherit him. Kagon, Ruvain ve'Yosef b'nei Yaakov yorshim zed zeh. So this is also a common thing in understanding the Mishnah. When we assign, we're trying to figure out, to go from a sort of a theoretical principle to a specific case, we imagine they're all the children of Jacob. So what's the situation? Ruvain and Yosef, who are brothers who share a father but not a mother, right? Yoshim zeh, they can inherit from one another. Afapish einam me'im echat, even though they're not from the mother. So in that situation, they are both nochel umanchil. And the Mishnah then also concludes somewhat redundantly, because we already said, Elu hein nochalin umanchilim, these are the ones who inherit and bequeath. And then at the end of the trio, we have again nochalin umanchilim, just in case you were confused. They indeed inherit and bequeath. Now we're on to the next category. Ha'ish et imo, v'ha'ish et ishto, Uvnei achayot nochalin velo manchilim. So a man and his mother, or towards his mother, and a man towards his wife, and children of sisters, they will inherit, but they will not bequeath, right? So a man can inherit a property from the mother. In biblical law and rabbinic law, the mother would never get the property if the son died, even if there were no other inheritors. Same thing with a man can inherit the property of his wife in biblical law and rabbinical law, but a wife would not inherit the property of the husband. That would go to the other offspring listed here. Uvene achayot, that one's a little more complicated, so I'll read you what it says in Gehati. Kolomar, b'nei achoto shel hamet yershimoto. The children of the sister of the deceased can inherit the deceased, right? So your nephews by your sister, or your nephews and nieces. If there's no one else closer on the family tree, your nephews, even through your sister, if you kind of struck out in the other place of the family tree, they would inherit. Kigon, this is another example where names of Jacob's family get thrown into a specific. B'nai Dina, imagine Dina, right, the daughter of Jacob, her children, Yorshim et Ruvain, can inherit from Ruvain, their uncle. Achia shel Dina, the brother of Dina. Kshe'ein leRuvain banim, if Ruvain died without children. V'lo hiniach av, and didn't leave a father, if Jacob's already dead. O ach, if all of Ruvain's brothers are dead. O achot, and Dina's already dead. So again, the situation is Ruvain dies, Jacob dies, all the other brothers are dead, and Ruvain's children are also gone. His sister would not inherit, but his sister's children would inherit. She'ilu Dina hayta kayemet hayta hi yoreshoto. If Dina had been alive, she would have inherited, but she died, and therefore her children, by dint of her relationship with him, inherit. Varei baneha yorshim mikocha. Her children inherit from her strength, from the power of her strength in the relationship. And then those are nochalin velo manchilim. Ha'isha et baneha, a woman and her children. V'haisha et ba'ala, and a woman and her husband. V'achei ha'em, and the brothers of the mother. Manchilim v'lo nachalin. This is the mirror image of the previous rule. It's the flip. So in terms of conveying data, it's not needed in the Mishnah. In terms of creating a nice 2x2 grid, it's helpful. If we had more time, we would linger on that. And in the last case, v'ha'achim min ha'em lo nochalin v'lo manchilin. If you remember the first situation, we had brothers from the father. They are in the category of both nochalin or manchilim, but brothers from the mother are neither in the category of nochalin or manchilim, because since everything would be going through the mother, and the mother never inherits from her child, so too her brother, the other offspring that come from the mother never inherit. Gehati says on that, V'ha'achim min ha'em, the brothers from the mother, shalo me'av echad, not from the same father. Lo nochalim v'lo manchilim, they neither inherit nor they bequeath. Zeh shekol echad nachalato chozeret el tzel krovei ha'av, because in that situation, all of the inheritance goes through the relatives of the father, and she is married to the father, but she's not, in a biblical sense, in terms of inheritance law, related to the father. So that's a taste, and it gives you a sense of the rabbis living in a real society, trying to take 3 or 4 verses from the book of Bamidbar and try to come up with practical law that would actually impact what would happen in Judea in the year 50 or Judea in the year 100. And of course, it might be ringing in your mind the story of the daughters of Tzlopchad, who are mentioned elsewhere in this chapter, who petitioned Moses in the desert so that some of the inheritance laws would favor even a little bit the notion of daughters whose father died without leaving male heirs, so that some of the money and some of the land could stay in that tribe. Now that you have some basic pshat, Yonatan will come and give you his interpretation of it.
You ready for the test? Rabbi and I did it for an hour and a half, and we ended up with more questions than answers. But it's a lot. It's a lot. And it's in civil law, nowadays civil law is no different. It's as complex. So here is to summarize the cheat sheet. Are you ready? So here is the order. The rabbis listed the following order of inheritance: sons and their descendants; second, daughters and their descendants; the father, brothers and their descendants; sisters and their descendants; the father's father, the father's brother and their descendants; the father's sisters and their descendants; the father's father's father, and the husband who also inherits from his wife, but not if she died childless soon after the marriage. This is just a cheat sheet of that. And so there are many, many complex situations that are not addressed by the above cheat sheet, and some of which are raised and resolved by the Gemara in Baba Batra, and some are not. For example, what happens if the dead the dead husband's heirs and wife and creditors all have claims? How do you resolve this one? Or what happens if the husband and wife are found both dead together, but it's not clear who died first, right? The wife cannot inherit the husband, but the husband can inherit the wife. That changes a lot of things. However, there is another whole category which is not addressed yet, and these have to do with a case in which a person who is still alive and wants his possessions to go to a certain descendant, but not according to the Torah laws. So, what about the case of a will, which can in fact lead to disinheritance of the Torah laws? And so, Rambam writes in Mishneh Torah, and you have it also there. He writes the following: if a person states, so and so is my firstborn son, he should not receive a double portion, or my son and so should not inherit my estate together with his brothers. His statements are of no consequence. It doesn't work. Similarly, if he says, let so and so inherit my estate when the dying man has a daughter, or let my daughter inherit my estate when he has a son, his statements are of no consequence. You cannot do that. And similar laws apply in all analogous situations. And so you can see that you can't override the law once you're dead. However, while alive, a person can decide what to do with their possessions, and they can give the property and money to others as they find fit, right? If I were today decide to give all my money to somebody, that will be before my death, and so the Torah laws do not apply. And if by then, right, soon after I die, then it's no longer mine to give. And so, depending on a person's desiring to bequeath their possessions was on their deathbed, shchiv mira, or healthy, bari, whether I'm about to die or actually I'm all healthy, there are a few ways of creating a will which is not in accordance with the biblical law. And these are mostly via revocable trusts or a deathbed gifts, but not chaim. So I'm about to die, I'm going to give all my gift to somebody, and that way I can overcome it and give it to a favorite heir. In other words, a person may have a will which indicates the transferring of possessions to whomever he desires, and an hour before the passing of that person's bequeathing. And so the possessions stay with the owner until his last hour, and the person still has the power to change their mind anytime beforehand. The only trick here is that you don't know when you're going to die. And so how can you say an hour before I'm going to die? And that's a whole halachic issue all there. But in this way, disinheritance and favoritism were made possible, which is not all bad. It also allowed daughters and mothers to benefit as well from their fathers and husbands' inheritance. Right? So that's another way to overcome it. And still, even when this loophole exists, the Mishnah states that if one gives his assets to others and leaves nothing to his sons to inherit, it is valid under Jewish law, but en ruach chachamim nocha himeno. The spirit of the sages is not pleased with him. The rabbis who were aware of these loopholes created a system of oral laws that and rules that that allow this, but also said, do not be among those who shift an inheritance, even from a bad son to a good son. And why not? Because the sort of a child who will emerge therefrom is not known. You never know, whether a good son or a bad son is indeed a good son or a bad son. This is a subjective perspective, right? And it's beyond us to know what they are, what their choices will be in the future. Through generations, Rabbi allowed wills to shift inheritances from one heir to another, as long as a significant amount remained for the heirs. And in the 20th century, two leading rabbinical authorities, Ashkenazi and Sfaradi, Rav Moshe Feinstein and Rav Ovadia Yosef, even approved total and partial disinheritances in case of extreme misconduct by the heirs. The heirs do something awful, they lose it, and the rabbis say that's okay. And as reference under modern Israeli law, which is based on biblical but also Ottoman, British, and international laws, sons and daughters share equally in inheritances. So we don't follow biblical law in Israel, but there are situations where you can take your inheritance to Beit Din, and in that case, they do take lead on the inheritance process. But putting our will aside, literally and figuratively, the one constant and certain for us all is our inevitable death. Essentially, this biblical algorithm, which dictates the division of possessions after our death, regardless of whether you agree with it, you find it fair or just, it's constant. No matter whether one person was rich or poor, famous or unknown, once dead, these laws apply on all of us in the same way, without exceptions. This is back to V'haita Levnei Israel Chukat Mishpat, as the Bamidbar read after those verses I read before. What we can learn from this is yet another reminder that our lives are remembered not by the size of the inheritance that we bequeath to our loved ones, but by the way that we live it until we die. And the Talmud in Masechet Shabbat 31a provides guidance to the kind of life that we should be living by raising questions one is asked before God after departing from this world. And this is something that that came to my attention, was taught to me by another rabbi of mine, Dr. Powell, Bruce Powell, who made this one actually the foundation and basis of the Toledo High School. Rava says, this is the Gemara, when a person is brought to judgment for the life he lived in the world, they say to him, ask him these questions. Did you conduct business honestly and avoided taking unfair advantage? You can ask yourself the same questions right now. Did you designate time for Torah study and made lifelong learning a value and a priority? Did you engage in procreation, raise children, and became part of a community? Did you await salvation, had hope, and engaged in tikkun olam? Did you use wise judgment to understand one matter from another, separate the argument from the individual in front of you, and let go of the unimportant? That's hard for me. And beyond all of these, is the fear of God is one's treasure? If yes, he is worthy. And if not, no. None of these accomplishments have any value. And so, money aside, and those questions aside, while an individual's personal will, as long as they're alive, may lead a person to increase the portion of or deprive altogether the relative's inheritance, and by doing so is giving that person a sense of power and control. Once dead, the Torah inheritance law systems take over and treats all circumstances in the same manner. Perhaps by doing so, the biblical system may even help families avoid disputes about matters of inheritance. And to conclude, my father dedicated a big portion of his life helping people make moral decisions regarding their possessions. Now that he is no longer alive, he no longer has to fight as the laws of nature take over, while his neshama can join the eternal truth he fought so hard for. Thank you.